now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Angela Bullard and Michelle.
That was Miss Snowdy McLean. She comes after her butter. Won't let me run over with it from just across the road. Her husband walked out of the house one day and left his hat on the banks of the big black river. That could have started something too. There might have been a little run on doing that in Morgana if it had been so willed. What King did, the copycats always might do. Well, King McLean left a new straw hat on the banks of the Big Black, and there are some who consider he headed west. Snowdy grieved for him, but in the decent way you grieve for the dead, more like. And nobody wanted to think around her that he treated her that way. But how long can you humor the humored? Well, always. But I could almost bring myself to talk about it to a passerby that'll never see her again or me either. Sure, I got time to talk. My name's Mrs. Rainey. Well, you seen she wasn't ugly. And those little blinky lines to her eyelids comes from trying to see. She's an albino. But nobody would ever try to call her ugly around here. Not with that tender, tender skin like a baby. Some said King figured out that if the baby started coming, he had a chance for a nest full of little albinos, and that swayed him. Oh, I don't say it. I say he was just willful. He wouldn't think it. Willful and outrageous to some several. Well, he married Snowy. Lots of worse men wouldn't have. No better sense. Them Hudsons had more than the McLeans, but none of them had enough to count or worry over. Not by then. Hudson money built that house, and built it for Snowdy. They prayed over that. But take King. Marrying must have been some of his showing off, and like, man never married at all till he flung in. Then he had to go and show the others how he could go right on acting. And like, look everybody, this is what I think of Morgana and McLean Courthouse and all the way between. Further, for all I know, marrying a girl with pink eyes. I swan, we all says, just like he wants us to, scoundrel. And Snowdy just as sweet and gentle as you find. Of course, gentle people aren't the ones you leave best. He had that to find out, so know all. Oh, sir, she'll beat him yet, balking. In the meantime, children of his growing up in the county orphans, so say several, and children known and unknown, scattered like. When he does come, he's just as nice as he can be to Snowdy, just as courteous. Was from the start. Haven't you noticed it prevail in the world in general? Beware of a man with manners. He never raised his voice to her, but then one day he walked out of the house. Oh, I don't mean once. He was gone a good spell that first time. So, he was educated in the law, and he traveled for somebody. That was the first thing he did. I'll tell you in a minute what he sold. And she stayed home and cooked and kept house and put her eyes straight out almost. Going to work, making curtains for all the rooms and all like that. At first it didn't look like they'd have any children. So it went the way I told you. They settled into it pretty easy. People took it for granted mighty early. Him leaving, him being welcomed home. Him leaving, him sending word, meet me in the woods. And him gone again, at last leaving the hat. I told my husband I was going to quit keeping track of King's comings and goings. And it wasn't long after that he did leave the hat. I don't know yet whether he meant it kind or cruel. Kind, I'm inclined to believe. Maybe she was meant it. Why do I try to figure? because fake Rainey ain't got a surprise in him and proud of it. So Fate says, well, now it's time for the women to settle down and pay attention to home folks a while. That was all he could say about it. So he wouldn't have to wait long. Here comes Snowy across the yard to bring the news. I seen her coming in a different walk. It was the way somebody comes down an aisle. Her sunbonnet ribbons was jumping around her springtime. Did you notice her little dainty waist she has still? I declare it's a mystery to think about her having straight ones. I was in the barn milking, and she come and stood at the head of the little Jersey lady maid. She had a quiet, picked out way to tell news. She said, I'm going to have a baby too, Miss Katie. Congratulate me. And me and Lady May both just had to stop and look at her. It looked like more than only the news had come over her. It was like a shower or something that struck her. Like she'd been caught out in something bright. It was more than a day. There with her eyes all crinkly with always fighting the light, yet she was looking out bold as a lion that day under her brim, and gazing into my bucket and into my stall like a visiting somebody. Poor Snowy. I remember it was Easter time, and how the pasture was all spotty there behind her little blue skirt in sweet clover. He sold tea and spices, that's what it was. Sure enough, it was 9 months to the day the twins come, after he went sallying out through those woods and fields and left his hat on the banks of the river with King McLean on it. I wished I'd seen him. I don't guess I've stopped him. Don't ask me why, but I wished I'd seen him. And nobody did. For Snowy's sake, here they come, bringing the hat and a big hullabaloo raised. They drug the big black for 9 miles down. Was it only 8? And sent word to Bovina and on clear to Vicksburg to watch out for anything to wash up or catch in the trees in the river. Sure, there never was anything, just the hat. They found everybody we were honestly drowned along the banks of the big black in this neighborhood. Mr. Sissel, down the store, he drowned later on, and they found him. I think with the hat, he ought to have laid his watch down if he wanted to give it a better look. So he kept just his bright rage. She didn't seem to give in. She must have had her thoughts, and they must have been one of two things. One, that he was dead. Then why did her face have a glow? It had a glow. The other, that he left her and meant it. Like people said, if she smiled then, you knew she was clear out of reach. I didn't know if I liked her glow. And she raged and stormed a little. To me, anyway, just Mrs. Rainey. The Hudson's all hold themselves in. But it didn't seem to me, running in and out the way I was, that Snowy never got a real good look at life, maybe. Maybe from the beginning. Maybe she just didn't know the extent. Not the kind of look I got. Way back when I was 12-year-old. Like something had been put to my eye. Well, she went on keeping house and getting fairly big with what I told you already was twins. She seemed to settle into her content. Like a little white kitty in a basket. Making you think she might put up her paw and scratch if anything was, after all, to come near. At her house, it was like Sunday. Even in the mornings. Every day. In that cleaned up way. She was taking a joy in her fresh, untracked rooms and that dark, quiet, real quiet hall that runs through her house. And I love Snowy. I love her. Except none of us felt very close to her all the while. We couldn't be close to her. She'd come out in her pretty clean shirtwaist and water her furs. She had the most remarkable flowers. She had her mother's way with flowers, of course, and give just as many away. Except it wasn't like you were out of kids. She was by herself then. Oh, her mother was dead by then. And her father 14 miles down the roadway, crippled up, running his store in a cane chair. It was every bit she had. Everybody tried to stay with her as much as they could spare. Not let a day go by without one of us to run in and speak to her and say a word about an ordinary thing. Twins come the first day of January. Miss Lizzie Stark, she hates all men and is real important. Across yonder's her chimney. She made Mr. Comstock, her husband, hitch up and ride to Vicksburg and bring back a Vicksburg doctor in her own buggy the night before instead of using Dr. Loomis here, and stuck him in a whole room to sleep at her house. She said, trust any doctor's buggy to break down on those bridges. Mrs. Stark stayed right by Snowy, and of course several and I stayed too, but Mrs. Stark was not budgeted and took charge when pains commenced. Snowy had those two little boys, and neither one of them albino. They was King McLean all over again, if you want to know it. Snowy clapped the names on them of Lucius Randall and Eugene Hudson, after her own father and her mother's father. It was the only sign she ever gave Morgana that maybe she didn't think the name King McLean had stayed beautiful. But not much of a sign. Some women don't name after their husbands till they get down to nothing else left. I don't think with Snowy even two other names meant she'd change yet. Not towards King, that scoundrel. Time goes by like a dream. No matter how hard you run, and all the time we heard things out in the world that we listened to, but that didn't mean we believed them. You know the kind of things. Somebody's cousin saw King McLean. Mr. Thomas Stark, the one the cotton and timber belongs to, he goes a little, and he claims 3 or 4 times he saw his back, and once saw him get a haircut in Texas. Those things you will hear forever when people go off, just to keep up a few shots in the woods. They might mean something, they might not. The most outrageous was the time my husband went up to Jackson. He said he saw the spit image of King at the parade. My husband told me in his good time, the inauguration of Governor Vardaman. He was right up front with the big ones and astride a fine animal. Of course, several people from here went, but as Mrs. Spite said, why wouldn't they be looking at the governor of the new capital? But King McLean could steal anyone's glory, or so he thought. When I asked my husband how he looked, I couldn't get a thing out of him. Except he lifted his feet across the kitchen floor like a horse and man in one, and I went after him with my broom. I do know if it was King McLean, he looked like, hadn't everybody been wondering though, been out of their minds to know where I've been keeping myself. I told my husband it reasoned to me it was up to Governor Vardaman to get hold of King and bring something out of him. My husband said, well, why pick on one man? And there was a parade going on, and what all? Men! I said, if I'd been Governor Vardaman and spied King McLean from Morgana in my parade as big as I was, and no call for it, I'd have brought the whole thing to a halt and called him to accounts. Well, what good would it have done you, my husband said. Plenty, I said. I was excited at the time it happened. Well, that's just as good a spot as any to call him forth, right in front of the state capitol with the band going, and just as good a man to do it. Well, sure. Men like that should be called forth in front of the world, I guess. Not that any of us would be surprised. Did you go and find him after the governor got inaugurated to suit you then? I asked my husband, and he said no. And reminded me, he brought me a bucket and brought me the wrong size, just like the ones I had saw King, or his twin. What twin? Well, through the years we'd hear it here and there. Sometimes two places at once. New Orleans and Mobile. That's people's careless way of using their eyes. I believe he's been to California. Don't ask me why, but I picture him there. I see King in the west, outwards gold and all like that. Everybody to their own vision. Well, what happened turned out to happen on Halloween. And seems already like something that couldn't have happened at all. My baby girl, Virgie, swallowed a button that same day later on, and that happened, it seemed like still. But not this. And not a word's been spoke out loud for Snooky's sake. So I trust the rest of the world will be as careful. You can talk about a baby swallowing a button off a shirt and having to be upended and her behind pounded, and it sounds reasonable if you could just see the baby. But you get to talking about something that's only a kind of near thing. Oh, dear horses. Well, Halloween, about 3 o'clock, I was over at Snowy's helping her cut out patterns. And the twins, they wouldn't play outside that day, but had a hold of the scraps and the scissors and the paper and pens and what all. And there underfoot, they were dressing up playing ghosts and boogers. Uppermost in their little minds was Halloween. They had on their masks, of course, tied on over their busted brown bobs and pressing a rim around the back. I was used to how they looked by then, but I don't like masks. They all come from Spot's store and cost a nickel. One was a Chinese kind, mean, with a dreadful thin mustache and black horsey hair. The other one was a lady with an almost scary sweet smile on her lips. I never did take to that smile. All day for it. Eugene Hudson wanted to be the Chinaman, so Lucius Randall had to be the lady. So they were making tails and doolollies and all kinds of foolishness, and sticking them onto their little middles and behinds, and snatching every scrap from the shirts and flannels me and Snowdy was cutting out on the dining room table. Every now and then we could grab a little boy and base something up on him, whether or no, but we didn't pay that much mind. We was talking about the prices of things for winter and the funeral of an old maid. We didn't hear the step porch give at all, and that was a blessing. And if it wasn't for something that happened outside us all to tell about it, I wouldn't have the faith I have now that it come about. But happening along the road like he does every day, old Les Morgan, everybody calls him. A Negro who lives down beyond me. Real old. Knows everybody since time was. He knows more people than I do. Who they are and all the fine people. If you wanted anybody in Morgana who wouldn't be likely to make a mistake in who a person is, you'd ask for old Les. So, he was making his way down the road by stages. He starts early, takes his time coming home in the evening, stopping to speak to people along the way and tell them good evening and ask after their health, except he didn't see a soul else on the road that day, except you'll hear hooves in it, on porches or in the yards. I can't tell you why, unless it was those little gusts of north wind that started blowing. Nobody likes that. But up yonder ahead was walking a man. Ples said it was a walk he knew, but it struck him it was from away in another time. And yet it wasn't just the walk of anybody supposed to be going along the road to McLean at that time. And yet it was, too. And if it was, Ples couldn't figure out what that somebody would be up to. That was a terrible way Ples was putting it to his mind. If you seen Ples that day, you know it was him. He had roses stuck in his hat from Miss Lizzie's garden. Fall roses, big as a man's fist and red as blood. They was bobbing from side to side out of Fanny's old black hat, and some other little scraps from out the garden, thrown away by Mrs. Stark. He was cleaning out her beds that day. It was fixing to rain. Presently, Ples says, the familiar stranger paused yard of the summer house and skim from cedar to cedar and under the fig tree at the back and under the wash. He'd be tearing it and come close to the front again, snippy-like. Les says, though he couldn't swear from the Presbyterian church exactly what Mr. King was doing, he knows as good as seen it, he looked in the blinds. He would have looked in the dining room. Have mercy. We shut the west out of Snowdy's eyes, of course. Finally, he came full front again, settled himself nice, and started up the front steps. The middle step sings when it stepped on, but we didn't hear it. But Ples said, well, he had on fine tennis shoes. So he makes his way across the porch, and what do you think he's fixed to do but knock on that door? Well, wasn't he satisfied with outdoors? On his own front door, he makes a little shadow knock, like trying to see what it would look like, and puts his present behind his coat. Of course, he had something there in the box for her. You know, he constitutionally brought home the kind of presents that break her heart. Standing there with one leg out, pretty to surprise him, and I bet a nice smile on his face. Don't ask me to go on. What if Snowdy had taken a notion to glance down the hallway and seen him there, all come kiss me like that? She couldn't see all that good, but I could. I was a fool and didn't look. It was the twins seen him through those little bitty mask holes, those eagle eyes. There ain't gonna be no stopping those twins. So, he didn't get to knock, but he had his hand raised a second time, and out come the children on him, waving their arms and hollering, boo, the way it would scare you to death. Or it ought to, if you wasn't ready for him. We heard him charge out, but we thought it was just a neighbor going by for them to scare if we thought anything. Ples says, accounting for all human mistakes, he's seen on one side of King come rolling out Lucius Randall all dressed up, and on the other side Eugene Hudson all dressed up. Could I have forgotten to speak of them being on skates? That was all afternoon. They was real good skaters, the little fellas. Not to have the sidewalk. They sailed out the door and circled around their father, flying their arms and making their fingers go scary, and those Buster Brown balls going in a circle. Les said they made a tremendous uproar with their skates, and that is no mistake, because I remember what a hard time me and Snowdy had hearing what each other had to say all afternoon. Les says King stood it a minute. He got to turning around too, and they were skating around him and saying in high, burning voices, "How do you do, Mr. Booger?" You know, if children can be monkeys, they're going to be them. Without the masks, though, those children would have been more polite about it. There's enough Hudson in them. Skating around and around their papa and just as ignorant. Poor little fellas. After all, they'd had nobody to scare all afternoon for Halloween. Except the YNMV train whistling through at 2:15. They scared that. The monkeys skating around their papa. When they got their papa in there, ring around to Rosie, and he couldn't get out. Ples said it was enough to make an onlooker a little uneasy. And he called once or twice on the Lord. And after they went around high, they crouched down and went around low about his knees. The minute come when King couldn't get out quick enough. Only he had a hard time, and it took him more than one try. But he gathered himself together, and King is a man of 6 foot high and weighs like a horse, but he was confused, I take it. But he got loose, and up and out like the devil was after him, or in him, finally, right up over the banister and the ferns, down the yard, over the ditch, and gone. He plowed into the rough toward the big black, and the willows waved behind him. And where he run in, Les don't know, and I don't, and don't nobody. He should have wrote another note instead of coming. carpet and follow us around the dining room table and pull on our skirts till we saw. Well, speak, said the mother. And they told her a booger had come up on the porch. When they went out to see him, he said, I'm going, you stay. So they chased him down the steps and run him off. But he looked back like this, Lucius Ringel said, lifting off his mask and showing us on his little naked face with his big round blue eyes. And Eugene Hudson said the booger took a handful of pecans before he got through the gate. And Snowdy dropped her scissors on the mahogany. And her hand stayed in the air and still she looked at me a minute long. At first she caught her apron to her. Then she started shedding in the hallway while she ran to the door, just in case anybody was still there, I suppose. She ran, and the little glass prism shook in the parlor. I don't remember another time from her. She didn't stop at the doorway, but she ran on through it. And she was looking both ways and ran down the steps and ran out into the yard. And she was holding on to the tree looking towards the country. But I could tell by the way her head held, there wasn't nobody. When I got to the door, I didn't like to follow right away. There wasn't nobody there at all, but old Ples going by, raising his hat. Ples, you didn't see a gentleman come up on the porch just now. I heard Snowdy call, and of course Ples, he said, no, I don't recollect one soul passed me the whole way from town. The children were holding on to me. I could feel them tugging. And my little girl slept through the whole thing inside, and then woke up to swallow that button. The leaves was rustling, different from when I went in. It was fixing to rain. The day had a two-way look, like a day will and change a year. Clouds dark, and the cold air still on the road. And the trees lighter than the sky was. The oak leaves scuttling and scattered against old Ples. You're real positive, I guess, Ples, Snowdy asked. Ples says, comforting like, you wasn't expecting nobody, was you? Of course, it wasn't until later that Miss Lizzie Stark got a hold of Ples and got the truth out of him, and I found out about it later through her church. But old Ples wasn't about to let Miss Snowdy McLean get hurt now, after we'd all watched her so long. So, he fabricated. After he went by, Snowdy just stood there in the cool without a coat, her face turned towards the country, pulling off little threads from her skirt and letting them loose in the wind, making little kind beads of it, till I went and got her. She didn't cry. Of course, I'd been a ghost, Ples said. But a ghost, I believe, if he'd come to call on the lady of the house, would have waited to have a word with her. Ples said he had narrowed out his mind. It was King McLean, headed home once more and thinking better of it. Mrs. Stark told the church ladies, I, for one, trust Ples. I trust him the way you trust me. Old Ples's mind has remained clear as a veil. I trust his story implicitly, because that's what I know King McLean would do. Run. And I guess that is one time I'm in agreement with Miss Lizzie Stark. Well, she don't know about it, I guess. I live in hope. He hit a stone and fell down running not far from here, and took the skin off his handsome nose, the devil. So that's why Snowdy comes after her butter now, and won't let me bring it to her any longer. I think she kind of holds it against me because I was there that day when he come. But she don't like my baby anymore. description. But I bet you my little Jersey cat can tear it long enough